things they can do on their own to cope?
It's so individualized for each person. What you want, first of all, we want to make sure that they have strong support systems, and that's absolutely critical, and strong, healthy support systems, because what we know is that if their caregivers are struggling, how the adults respond and cope has significant impact on how the children respond and cope. So we want to make sure that they have a strong, healthy support system, and if their parents or caregivers are struggling, that we help find supports for the families. We also want to make sure that we try to keep them engaged as much as we possibly can in a routine and in activities, realizing that we may have to make some concessions, because as I like to say, grief comes and goes in waves. You have some great days and you have some not so great days. So being understanding about that, but definitely keeping them engaged. What we also know is that there's what we call action-oriented coping. So being able to be involved in activities that can help others can be very helpful, as long as they're not forced into a spotlight that they're not comfortable with. But what we do know is, being active and also engaging in activities to help the community can be helpful. But the other thing too is finding, whether it's a support group or whether it's a therapist, it's finding the right match to where you can share your stories with others and you know that they understand. And I will say, from a mental health perspective, the advocacy work that they have done has been awesome. But what we also want to make sure is that there's not too much pressure being put on those students, that they don't have the ability to take the time to really process some of their own grief and their own emotions. Also, what we've discovered is with advocacy work, oftentimes comes disappointment, because your advocacy efforts, you run into a lot of roadblocks. Advocacy is very complex. And so sometimes that ends up compounding the grief process. So the action-oriented coping, we know to be very helpful, but as you run into roadblocks along the way, sometimes you want to make sure that those support systems are there. What we've discovered these days is that, especially with adolescents, with social media and all that stuff, grief is a little bit different than what it used to be. We used to talk to people. And now what we're finding out is some of these kids are turning to social media sites, and that becomes their network for which they're processing some of their grief. And so sometimes that's hard for the adults to understand, because it's a different generation with technology being entered into the equation. So I see a huge piece of my role is also helping the adults understand what the youth are going through, and then for the youth to understand what the adults are going through, and helping to build those bridges of support.